John Lee Real Estate, find you the best rates. All throughout Philly like Schuylkill Expressway. Talking to people who
Hello
out of the
everyone,
tour,
my name is John Lee, your local real estate agent in the greater Philadelphia area. I am here with a very special guest, Frank Lee. Frank, I'm going to let you do the introduction. If you can tell our audience a little bit more about yourself and what you do and what you got going on.
Sure. I am, as was mentioned, frankly, I'm a professor at Drexel University. I've been at Drexel for exactly 20 years since I came to Philadelphia to start working at Drexel in 2003. So 2023 basically hits the 20-year mark. Before then, I was at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, which is an engineering focused college university in upstate New York, in Troy, New York. I was there for 2 years. And before that, I was a graduate student. And before that, undergraduate at Berkeley, a graduate school at Carnegie Mellon. So I've been in school all my life. I've actually never held a real job like yourself, John, and other of your listeners and so on. So I've been in academia all my life. And in case there's a broader sort of, I guess, Korean or Korean American audience, I came to the U.S. when I was 10 years old from Korea. I grew up in Southern California since when I was 10. So I'm what people will consider, what Koreans will consider 1.5 generation. Not quite first generation because I came early enough, but not second generation certainly because I was not born here. So straddling the line between the first and second generation, 1.5 generation.
Yeah, and I think that's such a rare demographic now, considering the fact that most Korean Americans, and not just Korean Americans, but immigrants in America, they find that it's either you're a second generation or first generation. So to go on that topic as a 1.5 generation, like tell me about a little bit more about your experiences. Obviously, you coming to America at such a young age, you obviously adopted a lot of the American culture, yet still trying to figure things out with like your identity as a person. Like tell the audience if you can share a little bit more about that and what your experiences were.
Sure. So I guess I came to the US when I was 10. This was 1979, 1980, right around that time. Probably if you look at immigration or emigration from Korea, out, there was a huge peak around that period, would be my guess. So a lot of Koreans sort of leaving for their better life or the better life of their children during that time. And certainly I was one of them. During that time, probably much like every other immigrant, not just Koreans, but all immigrants, you face certain amount of racism in the States, going to schools and so on. Being called chink was fairly common at that time. Hopefully less so now, but so you have some of that, but certainly I wasn't steeped in it, thankfully. I was able to form sort of close friendship with about, I would say, three people who were close friends with me since junior high, all the way through high school, and all four of us, three of my friends, including myself, that went on to Berkeley. So we've sort of held on sort of this long friendship. One was Korean American who was born in the US, and the other two were non-Koreans. One thing that I just remember distinctly was I came when I was 10. My sister, who was 3 years older, who came to the US when she was 13, I primarily had sort of non-Korean friends, or if they were Korean, we were speaking English. They were sort of fully Americanized and so on. So I acclimated, I think, to American culture fairly rapidly, especially language-wise, whereas my sister still reads books in Korean, even at this point in time. And she is much more fluent in Korean. Because when she came to the US at 13, most of her friends, I believe, were Korean. And she was sort of speaking Korean. So there was that divergence as well. Certainly thankfully, LA, even then, even before then, was pretty diverse, right? Especially if you're growing up in LA, you have a lot of Asians, a lot of Koreans there, and so on. So I probably didn't face as much racial animosity myself versus other Korean Americans who might have gone to like the southern states or the Midwestern states where they may be only one, right, of like 99% white and so on. So I feel like I was lucky in that sense. And certainly my heart goes out to everyone who've gone through that process in trying to not only find who they are as you were growing up, but at the same time, sort of facing that animosity as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy because even as a second generation Korean for me, just based on like what you look like, obviously there's going to be some level of racial tension between you and some other parts of the communities or whatever you're a part of.
Yeah.
And I even for me, I dealt with some adversity, but I would say at least being a Korean American now has my personal opinion, and this is just me anecdotally saying, like just looking around, I think it's a great time to be a Korean because I feel like Korean pop music has gotten so popular. It's been accepted as mainstream music. Korean barbecue is like considered to be a very trendy type of food to eat. There's a lot of good things that people are starting to become a little bit more receptive to, and I think our country is going in a great direction in that regard. And I do feel that a lot of people in your part of the generation often become neglected because it's kind of like, who do you relate yourself to? Like, you're technically not a second generation and you're obviously not a first. So it's kind of like, I don't know if you ever felt like the middle child, but and it's also very rare. I don't find too many people that are in your position. But one of the things that I want to let our audience know, and typically I ask this question, but just to kind of let our audience know for background, Frank and we met through the Korean American Association through an event, and we held a seminar. We held our seminar, and Frank was on the panel, and he spoke so freely, and also I felt like he related a lot to students. So I really wanted to dedicate this part of the podcast to really a lot of the younger to the younger group or audience to listen, and also to really be aware of opportunities if they ever do exist. So to kind of go on to that topic, Frank, with your level of education, your background in education and academia, like what are your general thoughts for someone that is either in high school or looking to go into college? Like, what are some things that they should consider as far as like options go? What should they be looking at? If you were a parent, what are some things that you would try to really help your child if you were in that position?
Sure. And let me kind of sort of pause that question briefly, and I'll come back to it.
Sure.
Because I do want to say one thing to kind of to wrap up what I was saying before. As I mentioned, all of us, myself including, and you, and even the younger kids these days, probably face some aspect of sort of like racial animosity, racism in their life. But I do want to say, it's not that the US is any better or worse than any other country. I mean, actually, I feel like US is better because we're sort of confronting it explicitly. So if you look at Korea, for example, I mean, that's because I know Korea, but I'm sure this is true with other countries. There's a huge amount of racism, right? Especially in Korea, people against non-Koreans face that in a very harsh way, in a very explicit way. Um, of all the countries that I want to live in, I would choose America as the best place, just because unlike the undercurrent of racism that's kind of accepted and so on, at least we, in certain part of the US, of the country, are trying to sort of deal with it much more explicitly, and are resolving it and working through it. And that's not true in, I think, most of the countries. That said, sort of going back to your question, another reason why I feel like US is one of the best countries, and one of the reasons why I feel, in some sense, blessed to have straddled both culture to a certain degree. I grew up enough in Korea to have, at a DNA level, some aspects of Koreanness. At the same time, I grew up in the US. So I'm familiar with Korean education system, both explicitly but also at a sort of emotional level. If you look at how Korea's educational systems work, it's heavily tracked. Right? What I mean by that is you have to be in sort of good, almost like elementary school and good after-school programs in order to get to good middle school programs, in order to get into good high school, in order to get into good college. And unfortunately, your success in life is hugely dependent on what college you might go to in Korea. And there aren't that many, unlike the States and so on. So that's why there's so many people trying to get into, the top, what they call SKY, Seoul National University, Yonsei, Korea University, and so on, and other Seoul-based prominent universities. Because once you go there, that relies on a huge network of alumni. So there's a very tight system of alumni that is able to sort of support you. If you're in that group, great. But if you're outside that group, sometimes it's going to be hard to get jobs. So for example, an academic program might sort of consist of largely people from like one university, right? If you're faculty, of what I mean, if you're trying to get a job and you're from other university, you might have much harder time trying to get into that, and so on. And I feel like because of that, there's so much emphasis on education, on after schools, where even starting maybe late elementary school to early junior high in Korea, you'd be going to hagwons, essentially the after schools, up to 11 p.m., 12 p.m. at night, come back to sleep and so on.
And for our audience, Frank, could you just explain what a hagwon is?
Yeah, so these are basically private, meaning they're paid by the parents on essentially almost like tutoring, not one-to-one necessarily, but a sort of extra class you would take on different subjects, whether it's math, English, and so on. That's all geared towards, in some sense, getting the best test scores on their equivalent, the Korean equivalent of SAT, because that score will heavily heavily, I guess, geared towards which school you could get into, and so on. And those are called hagwons. And probably the kids in Korea spend more time in hagwons than they do in actual school, and so on. So there's an enormous amount of financial commitment by the parents, paying for these extra curricular classes. And given that, there is also economic disparity, right? Essentially, the more money the parents have, the more money they're able to put into these extracurricular activities for their child, who then gets the benefit overall to try to get a better score. On, I think it's called CSAT. I could be wrong, but the Korean version of SAT. Whereas coming back to the U.S., something that I deeply appreciate about U.S. is I mean, the school that you go to, if you go to like a named or a higher value, in quotes, school, like essentially everyone has heard of Harvard, or Caltech or Stanford or Berkeley. I mean, those, if you go to a great school, great. I mean, but the how your life will go is far less dependent on which school you go to. You could be fine going to a regular state universities or Cal States and so on. You don't even have to go to college. I mean, there is lots of data to show that there's a benefit to going to college, but there's a path. There's a path for you there on how you want to go. Even if you don't do well in high school, for example, you could go to community college. If you go do well, you have a path toward going to, a good college and graduating and so on. So, and there's just so many variety of universities in the States. So I feel like there's so much of the safety system, what I would say, that is, it's not that if you fall off the track, if you just do a little bit poorly on high school, then your life is ruined. In an extreme case, I mean, it's not like that at all. If you do that, then you just kind of pick yourself up, able to succeed in a variety of ways, and so on in the U.S. So I feel like in that sense, that is the really the benefit of the U.S. And in particular, I feel like, especially the Korean first generation Koreans coming from Korea, they bring with them reasonably so the mindset of getting to good schools, right? Getting to Penn, go. You have to go to Harvard. You have to go to sort of these top name schools and so on. But ultimately, as someone who grew up and who been in the essentially academia for all my life, it really doesn't matter, to be completely honest. It's great that you go to Harvard, but if you get essentially like D average of your grades, that's not going to help you all that much. What's more important, I would say, is just doing well. Whichever school you go to, you want to maintain a good GPA, because that's the first thing that that recruiters will look at and so on. How well did you do? I mean, if you school name will have some slight benefit, but it's just not that much. It's just more important to do well. And it's one of those things where I feel like I would want to advise not just the parents, but also the kids as well, because the kids these days, in preparing for college, will be heavily influenced by their parents, right? Of emphasis for going to great college and so on. If you get to a great college, great. But the other thing I would also emphasize, and this is something that that I mentioned in our panel as well, John, is what's I realize now that's much more important to consider is debt, right? Essentially, debt you're going to accrue and that you're going to have coming out of school. If you go to Harvard and you're paying all by yourself, and if your parents are working to the bone paying for that education, it's not clear to me that it's worth it. Versus you go to good state school and come out with no debt, and so on. Just the fact that you have 100K or even more at the end of your undergraduate. You're basically putting a ball and chain on your leg for the next 20, 30 years of your life, trying to pay off that debt. Especially if you're starting out right at college, your salary isn't going to be that great, right? So you're going to be toiling away at that debt, and which is going to drastically restrict the type of career that you could have, because you're going to go more towards money, which is not a bad thing. But you don't have the freedom to go into like nonprofit, for example, or other type of careers where the financial calculus might not be aligned with the fact that you have so much debt. I was blessed having gone to Berkeley at the time in the late 80s, where the tuition for me was I believe somewhere around $1,200 when I started.
Oh my gosh.
And when I graduated, it doubled to $2,400.
Yeah.
I mean, there's cost of living, right? Which is
Right.
about 30K that I was paying maybe for housing and so on. But thankfully, that was an amount that my parents were able to cover. So I graduated with no debt. And although I did not realize at the time how important that was, now being a faculty, seeing students, right, graduate with so much debt, where there's so much stress and burden. I rather my child goes to a state school or some school where they end up with no debt versus going to like Harvard and Princeton. Unless Harvard and Princeton is giving them sort of full scholarship, I rather that is going to be a big factor, I think, more of a factor than people realize in trying to navigate education for my own kids.
So I have a question, Frank, to really piggyback on that. So let's just say you have a child, right? You're a father, right, of a child, and your son or daughter comes up to you, and ideally, right, I'm gonna paint an extreme picture, right, based on what you're saying, right? And I guess I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate, right? But if that's the case, then I would say, like, let's have everyone go to community college, because most likely not everyone is going to be going to Harvard or UPenn or any of those Ivy League type of schools. But like, I'm sure your child also has a certain lifestyle or demographic that they want to be part of that fits their kind of like social needs, I guess the best way to put it. Because a good example that I can give you is I had friends that went to, for example, NYU, right? NYU is a great school, but it's also a great social school as well. So I'm sure they went for those reasons, and they were willing to put themselves, without knowing, obviously, without knowing, putting themselves into huge amounts of debt. Hindsight, if I asked the same NYU students now who graduated already, would they make that decision now? I think I would say 9 out of 10 of them would probably say no. But when we're younger, when your child is making these decisions, obviously, how do you help them as a parent, and how do you also convey to other students how to make those decisions that might seem really tough for them because of social reasons?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, especially from a child, from the child's perspective, I sort of imagine if they've been studying hard, right? If their parents have been telling them to go to good school and they get into good school. But so for example, like Penn, I believe the first year is like $70,000, right? If
Yeah.
you're not getting anything, if you're not getting any support, that's essentially, that's just first year. And I believe that just might be tuition, but I could be wrong. If you add on, uh, living expenses like the dorm, you have to be in a dorm for the first year and so on, that could easily get up to 100K and so on. And certainly Drexel is not cheap either. Drexel is a private university. Though it has a co-op program where you're working like 1.5 years as part of your education, it certainly is not inexpensive. It's tough because you see from a child's perspective, they've been working hard, studying hard, they get into a good school. And certainly they want to go. It's validation, right, of their achievement. And in a certain sense, I feel like from the parents' perspective, it's a validation from the parents' perspective. Yeah, my child got into XYZ, Princeton, Yale, or whatnot. I would only say that I would just want them to consider that in that as they're thinking about it, because I feel like at this point you're not thinking about it.
Mhm.
Parents are not thinking about it. The child isn't thinking about it, and so on. Right? Essentially, 4 years down the line, are you okay carrying a 200K essentially debt that's has probably at that time somewhere around like 6, 7, 8% interest rate.
Right.
That's essentially a mortgage, 30-year mortgage, which restricts on what house you could get and so on.
Right.
The benefit, if I could say it, though it's not as clear as it would be in Korea. I mean, the calculus would be different if you're in Korea, where the system is so hierarchical, right? Where that networking of being at Seoul National University might be so strong, right? That that it might be worthwhile to go there or to go to Yonsei and so on. But here, I feel like you could network. I mean, one benefit of going to a good university is that you're going to have a cohort of people who are smart in certain sense. And it's nice to be connected to that area. But in the US, you could build up that network naturally through other means. It doesn't have to be school. Ultimately, the school is there for education, right? To learn something, being a mechanical engineer, be a physicist, and so on. In that sense, I think you're going to get just as good as education at any number of schools, small liberal arts schools, state universities, and so on, where you don't have to go so much into debt to get that education. But what I would say as an academic is that whereas the place you go to for your undergraduate is not that important, just do well or wherever you are. So given that, consider that as a big factor, and considering where do you go. But grad school is a bit different. So if you're going for a PhD, it really doesn't matter where you go because it's more of an apprentice program. So it's not the name of the school that's important, but it's who you're going to study with that's going to be important. Who your advisor is going to be very important, and so on. So grad school is very different. But for undergraduate, I would rather have my child go to State University or even Drexel because I'm a faculty, and this is a typical perk for academics. So if you're a faculty at a University X, usually you're able to get your tuition waived if your child goes to that school.
Right.
Drexel is the same way, and Penn was the same way. So my thing for my kids would be, go to Drexel unless you get a heavy scholarship to somewhere else. And if you do, that's going to be on them. I just want to make sure that they make a very clear choice. And you're there as a parent to make sure that they have the agency to make that choice, but they also really seriously think about the fact that they're going to be in debt.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Frank, would you advise parents or students, if they're looking at schools, to really look at here is what a 10-year loan is going to look like once you graduate, and based on it being $200,000 versus $25,000 going to this school, are you giving them that? Would you suggest for them to go through that route of really looking at it through the finances? And if you are, which probably you are going to say yes, what other factors or key factors should these students keep in mind?
Yeah. So I would say as you're applying, you're going to be sending 30, 40, 50 applications, right? You're going to spread out your application and to figure out who responds. Then once you get the acceptances in, that's the time where you are going to particularly pay attention to the debt, right? So it's not the loans are debts, right? Essentially,
Right.
Unless you're getting a grant, they're giving you the money. You want to figure out what that cost is spread out over 4 or 5 years. Each year you're going to accumulate that debt at the total what it is and how long it's going to essentially take to pay that off, and so on. That's I just want that to be a critical consideration as they're sort of picking school, right? So I've often sort of seen anecdotally, right, by word of mouth, especially Korean parents, right? They're just paying to the bone. It's not just the kids, right? The parents are going to take out money and so on to send their child to Princeton versus some great school, right? For example, like Case Western might have, who a lot of parents may never heard about, but it's a fantastic school, giving you essentially a nearly free ride, right? Versus where you're putting on maybe 50K, debt a year. I would at Princeton, let's say, I mean, something that people might have heard of. Korean parents might have heard of. I would choose Case Western right away. I mean, it's just not even a second thought.
Right.
Now, if you have the money, right? If you're rolling in money, fine. Just send your kid to wherever they want to go. But it's not just the kids. A lot of times, it's the parents who go dead into themselves, right? Of trying to pay for their child's education and so on. And that's very Korean, and so on. So it's not a factor that's often in the minds of Korean parents, but certainly I know it's a factor in a lot of American households, American parents, and so on. Right? Basically, they'll tell a child, "Well, it's your debt, you pay for it." So a lot of them end up going to state school, right? Because they just can't afford it, and so on. But I feel like that type of calculus has long been not thought deeply among Korean parents, just because of the cultural emphasis of getting into good school is just so I think layered into the DNA of Korean parents and Koreans in general and so on. So if one thing that I just want them to sort of consider is that, other things, not so much, but I think it's just if anything, just one thing, just consider. Just take the debt into account as you're figuring out which child that not only the parents, but also from the child's perspective, from the child themselves, thinking about where they want to go.
Yeah, no, I think you hit the nail on the head because at the panel, I had friends that were doctors that were there, Inky and Esther, and they talk about like what they had to go through, obviously, and the amounts of debt that they had to go. And even for someone like Inky, where he had to even change his career into specialty because he knew that the income that he was making as a general practice doctor wasn't going to be enough. So just a lot of things that people learned after the fact as opposed to learning ahead of time. And I always appreciate the insight that you've given based off of just the merit and experience that you have. To completely switch gears, one of the things that really struck my curiosity, and I think even on the panel discussion, I was kind of impressed, was your recognition by the Guinness Book of World Records, right? Was it skyscraper Tetris? Is that what it is?
Yep.
Just for our audience, tell us a little bit about that, like your project, some of the other projects that you got going on. Just so we can kind of give our audience a better frame of reference of what you do.
Sure. So I guess if I could put it into just summarize what I do, is sort of my work as a faculty, as an academic at Drexel, involves essentially my area is game design. So I found the game design program at Drexel University, which is considered, I feel like, one of the top 10 game design programs in the nation, and has been consistently been so for the past 13, 14 years. And what I teach game design classes, and game design meaning sort of video games that people sort of think about, but not only video games, but board games or games in general, games that we play. So I teach game classes, and in my own work, what I do is I think about using game technologies and apply it broadly, and trying to figure out interesting ways to apply it. So whether they are applying for games for health. So a recent project that I am working closely with is with Yale Medical School, their pediatrics division. So I have a collaborator there where we're trying to use game engines to create simulations for pediatric patients, their patients, to better inform them about their disease and the treatment that's involved through VR headsets. I've done others or games for health type applications where I worked with Pfizer to create Minecraft mod to help kids with hemophilia and so on. A lot of my work also involves using games as a tool for outreach to try to get young students who are underrepresented in the game and tech industry. These are women as well as minorities and so on. But at the middle school level, to try to get them interested in the tech and game area. So hopefully they will then choose that as a career path when they go to college and beyond. So I've had a number of grants and work involved in that aspect of it. As well as much like the Skyscraper Tetris, where it's just applying game engagement and game technology in more like an installation art area, where I consider the Tetris project as an installation art, where we did a large, essentially skyscraper installation to try to engage people in Philadelphia in an interesting way. So going back to the Skyscraper Tetris, it was if people are familiar with Philadelphia, especially 30th Station, there's a building called the Sears Center that's right next to it. I mean, there's no other tall building next to it. So that's it's right next to 30th Station. And what's unique about that building is that the facade of the building has these embedded LED lights. They're about, I would say, 10 feet apart horizontally between floors. So if you take the biggest essentially side of the facade of the Sears Center, you get somewhere around 20 by 23 lights. And typically they will have very simple light shows, right? Essentially lights changing color from one corner of the building to the other in a time series, in a wave, or lights or changing colors, or very simple logos like the Phillies, Eagles, and so on.
I mean, for reference, the desktop or the background that you have that's for our audience.
Yeah, that's the Sears Center. That's the Sears Center. Yeah. So it's not a high resolution. It's not like it's a 4K display. It's just these LED lights that are apart by 10 feet by between floors, and the building itself is 29 floors, I believe. Right. So if you take the largest rectangle, you have somewhere between 20 by 23 lights, and essentially they become sort of pixels, right, in my hand. So this is more closer to like the old handheld games. And it might even be before your time, John, but there were these LED games like from Tiger Electronics and other places long time ago, where you play football between 3 lines of LEDs. Or there was, I believe, a basketball, which is, again, is just like 10 by 10 like LED lights on these sort of handheld pre-Game Boy, basically. So it's I really like the fact that it's low resolution, and given that it constrains me in thinking about what I wanted to do. So in 2013, I actually, before Tetris, that's represented in the background, before Tetris, I did Pong. So if people are not familiar with Pong, it was the first commercial video game that was released on Atari by Atari. Mm-hmm. And the Atari 2600 console also had Pong, where you have essentially like a 2D tennis between 2 bars that with a ball going back and forth, right? So I did that in 2013, and then as a follow-up, I did Tetris in 2014, both for Philly Tech Week, and we've had I think for Tetris somewhere around about 2,500 people, at the Aikens Oval, which is essentially the big oval right below the art museum, if you're familiar with that area. And this is the shot from Aikens Oval, looking at the north face of the Sears Center, where we had people play Tetris as part of the 30th year anniversary of Tetris. And if you actually look at the type of games like Pong and Tetris, this is not a game that will be maybe easily familiar with the young kids these days, but certainly these are the games that I grew up with. Pong was the first video game that I played. And Tetris is a game that I obsessively played when I was in college, when I was in Berkeley, and so on. So in one sense, it's almost like a love letter to the games that I grew up with, the early video games that I grew up with. But in the other sense, it's nice because both Pong and Tetris are what I consider, cultural artifacts. They've achieved the level of being a cultural artifact. And what I mean by that is, even people who've never actually played Pong, I don't know if you ever played Pong yourself or not.
I have, but like games have gotten so advanced that like Pong to me is like the most boring thing. So
even if people have never played Pong, I feel like they will recognize what it is.
Oh yeah.
Right? If you sort of see two things going back and forth with a ball. And with Tetris shapes, even if you never played Tetris, you'll recognize Tetris, right? Because they become part of our sort of cultural fabric, right? Sort of essentially. So what worked for me as a installation artist, I guess, in one sense, was not the fact that I'm putting these games on a skyscraper, which technically and I guess was interesting and was kind of cool in that sense. But what was interesting to me was the fact that by putting these games on that tall skyscraper, the Sears Center, and especially because at that time, although there are tall buildings going up right now around Sears Center, as you can see, right, it's the only tall building that's there because of the train tracks that are on the other sort of buildings or spots. Versus if you look at, I guess it would be this side, toward not University, but Center City, where there are all these tall buildings. If I had it in one of those buildings, it would be occluded, right? So you can't really see it from far away. Whereas the nice thing about the Sears Center is that you could view that building almost anywhere throughout the city, right? So what I thought was really interesting was the fact that by putting Pong and Tetris on that tall building that's viewable from anywhere around Philadelphia city, is that for those couple of hours that we played Pong and Tetris in 2013 and 2014, not only the people who played the game enjoyed it, not only the people who were watching essentially at the Aikens Oval at Philadelphia Art Museum, watching it and enjoying it, but people from far away, right, around the city could see it and recognize it and be part of that essentially social engagement. That was what was interesting to me. If I had some random game that I created on there, people know what it is, right? And they'll just kind of look at it and then look away. But the fact that they could easily recognize Pong and easily recognize Tetris was key part of this desire to create and bring together at a citywide scale, people being connected and being socially sort of connected together through this game for a couple of hours.
Yeah, that's awesome. And yeah, I mean, to part with some of the last words here for our podcast, as a professor, right, what is your message to the youth, or what is your message to the parents of the youth that are looking to go to college?
Yeah, what I would say is this, and this is something that I have also, this is an advice that I've given to like the high school students who would visit Drexel. So this is the same advice. One, wherever you go, if you come to Drexel, fantastic. But if you go somewhere else, that's fantastic as well. Wherever you end up, just it's important to maintain a good GPA. The reason why I say that is a lot of times being in college, you're away from the pressure cooker that was your parents, right? Essentially driving you to school. So a lot of times the kids might have easily lost their way, right? Essentially relax, and so on. But I feel like, I mean, GPA is important, but also only important initially, right? Because once you build up a career, it's just more what you've done as a career that's going to be important. And GPA doesn't become important at all. So certainly maintain good GPA, and I don't mean you do a straight A. I feel like long as you're around like A minus, you're fine. You could get some Bs, it could get A's. And the other thing is that I feel like this is something that I realized much later. Getting good grades is not that difficult. Getting a B is not that difficult, especially if you're having problems. You should reach out to your professors. And they're there to try to help you. And from a professor's perspective, right? I feel like it's much easier to, I guess, for me to go above and beyond for a student who I know who's trying, versus a student who doesn't care, right? So if someone is reaching out to me and just really wants to do well, my heart will go out to that person, and I'll try to work with that. I mean, that's just me. It might be different for other faculty, but I feel like that's a sort of general phenomenon. So do that. And I think even if it's not a class that you're a strong student, you could, I feel it's reasonable to get a B in that class, and that's fine, right? The other thing I would say is take advantage of the fact that you're in college in this sense. That is, college is the only time, is that transition period, right? Between being a student and then you're getting ready to go out into the world of jobs and basically paying for yourself and pay for and being independent and so on. So that's not going to come just from just taking classes, right? The pattern that you've had so far up to high school is just taking classes, right? You're told to take this class, you take this class. College really should be the time, if you can, to try to really figure out what you want to do with your life, right? You've been told to go to engineering school, right? That's the typical the Korean parents' response when you go into tech, go into computer science. Great if that's for you, but if that's not for you, your just heart is not going to be in it. I feel like what I wanted to tell people is that, to students, and this might not be, the parents should close their ears for a second, is that ultimately you're going to be responsible for your life. Your parents are not, right? Your parents love you, but you have to understand that this is your life. Whatever you decide, it should be something that you feel strong about. Possibly that's computer science, great. But if it's something else, I want students to kind of think hard about a career path that's right for them, because it would be sad to be stuck doing something that you're not that passionate about for the 40, 50, 60 years of the rest of your life, right? Yeah. That you're going to be responsible for. Yeah. And the thing is there's going to be a lot of pivots in your life, right? Just because you decided to do one thing in college doesn't necessarily mean that's what you'll be doing 10 years from now, because as along you decided, well, this is not it, and then go this way. And that, that happens quite often and so on. So college is not the end of your life, right? A lot of people feel like, college, whatever you choose is going to be essentially the future. It isn't. Just use that time more to figure out and grow as a person, grow as an independent person, and then try to take responsibility for your decisions. Because up until that point in time, my assumption is that you had very little agency. But after college, the assumption is that you're going to take on the full agency of your life. And college is that time to try to learn how to do that, including what you want to study. And one great thing about being in the US is whatever you end up studying, I feel like it could apply to whatever career path that you want to go to. and career path that may change, every 5 or 6 years. And certainly it has changed for me because I've done nothing now that's related to the PhD that I've ended up getting, and so on. So I pivoted a number of times in my life to end up where I am. But throughout that pivot, what I can say is I decided to follow more what I was interested in doing, not necessarily what might be quote unquote best for me, right? From the outside. And that may not always been a smooth path, but I've never regretted the decisions that I made along the way.
No, that's awesome, Frank. And thank you so much for sharing. And for our listeners, if they ever wanted to reach out to you, what's the best way for them to reach out to you?
Sure. I mean, so my emails is very public. It's very easy as well. Probably email is the best way because that's something that I check more constantly than anything else. And it's fairly straightforward. It's just my initials, which is F J L at drexel.edu.
Okay. And I'll put that in the description below if anyone wants to obviously reach out to you. But Frank, thank you so much for your time.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely, John. It was great talking to you. And great seeing you as well.
All right, take care.
Bye-bye.
John Lee Real Estate, find you the best rate. All throughout Philly like Schuylkill Expressway. Talking to people who out of the 215, even the 267, who always helping like, oh, no time for no student.